Ymir, the ancestor of giants. Like with most mythologies, including Mesopotamian and Egyptian, the Norse pantheon had its primeval entity in the form of Ymir. The ancestor of all JTNA are mythic entities that ranged from giants to other fantastical creatures. Ymir was perceived more as the first being, as opposed to a strict categorization as one of the Norse gods. He was created by the ice of Niflheim combined with the heat of Muspelheim, long before the existence of the earth. And after his own genesis, Ymir, with his hermaphroditic body, was responsible for birthing male, female, and other mythical beings who in turn would go on to bear future generations. The narrative of Ymir also took a tragic turn, much like the other primeval deities of ancient mythologies. To that end, he was given an ill-fated ending due to his apparent evil machinations. To that end, Buri, created after Ymir, often acknowledged as the first of the Norse gods, had a son named Bor, who finally married one of Ymir's descendants, Bestla, and their union produced 3 sons, Vili, and Odin. But the angry Ymir confronted these ascending young Norse gods, which eventually led to his own death at the hands of the 3 brothers. The 3 Norse gods, including Odin, then proceeded on to create the entire earth, much like the Mesopotamian Marduk from Ymir's fallen body, with his blood accounting for the seas and oceans, while his bones made up the rocks and mountains. Furthermore, his hair was used for the trees, his skull was transformed into the sky and heavens, and his brains were made into clouds. And finally, his eyebrows were fashioned into the Midgard, the middle realm or earth of mankind. Odin, the king of the Aesir gods. Odin in Old Norse, possibly the most revered yet enigmatic of all Norse gods, was regarded as the king of the Ser tribe of gods, thus making him akin to the supreme god. Historically, Odin had always been prominent in the pantheon of Germanic mythology, as is evident from Tacitus' late 1st century AD work Germania, where Odin is seen as the equivalent of the Roman god Mercury, and given his mythical eminence over the cultural framework of the Germanic people. Odin was associated with various and often antithetical aspects ranging from wisdom, healing, royalty to death, sorcery, and even frenzy. Interestingly enough, the character of Odin was often portrayed as the haggard wanderer who relentlessly seeks knowledge, in spite of his regal status as the ruler of the Asgard. Such contradictory portrayals mirrored his nature of a quest for wisdom. One of these stories talks about the deity's thirst for knowledge and wisdom. In the story, Odin willingly gouges out one of his own eyes as a sacrifice for Mimir, a shadowy being who possesses unparalleled knowledge because of its consumption of the water from the well of Erd. Mimir in return offers Odin a draught from the well that draws water from the roots of the Yggdrasil, the cosmic world tree that binds the 9 worlds of Norse mythology. On the other hand, the one-eyed Odin also has a sinister, albeit on a nascent level, side to him. On some occasions, Odin is easily provoked, which leads to disastrous conflicts and wars. Essentially, when perceived as a war god, Odin was seen as the epitome of battle frenzy and chaos, aspects that were favored by the warlords and berserkers. In any case, in our modern-day context, the name of Odin, the All-Father, is related to Wednesday, since the word is derived from Wednesday, Woden's day, with Odin being referred to as Odin in Old English and Oten in Old High German. Frigg, the queen of the Aesir gods. Frigg was regarded as the queen of the Ser and the goddess of the sky, thus possibly venerated as the foremost of all Norse goddesses when it came to their pantheon. Moreover, Frigg, with her power of foreknowledge, was also frequently associated with fertility, household, motherhood, marriage, and even domestic matters. Also, with her special status as Odin's wife, it was the mythic aspects of Frigg that were mostly related to the perceived bliss of family life. On the other hand, Frigg's love for family and motherly protectiveness also leads to the tragic episode of her favored child Baldur's death discussed later. Interestingly enough, in spite of Frigg's eminence in later Norse mythology during the Viking period. Her Old Germanic version is steeped in mystery, a factor that is still debated in the academic world. Pertaining to the latter, according to one of the origin-based hypotheses, Mother Frigg was possibly identified with the goddess Freya, who is discussed later in the article during the Proto-Germanic period. But as scholar Stefan Grundy mentioned in his book The Concept of the Goddess, the problem of whether Frigg or Freya may have been a single goddess originally is a difficult one, made more so by the scantiness of pre-Viking Age references to Germanic goddesses and the diverse quality of the sources. The best that can be done is to survey the arguments for and against their identity, and to see how well each can be supported. Thor, the loyal defender of Asgard. Thor in Old Norse, the god of thunder, with his burly might and boisterous ways, epitomized the formidable warrior who was accorded high status in the Germanic society of ancient and early medieval times. Regarded as the son of Odin, and his wife Fyrgyn, not to be confused with Frigg, Thor, with his red beard and eyes, was hailed as the loyal and stalwart defender of the Sur's stronghold of Asgard, thus suggesting his symbolic role as the protector of the ordered cosmos. Suffice it to say, according to Poetic Edda, Thor, the thunder god, was considered the strongest of all beings among both gods and men, and his strength was rather amplified by some of his specially crafted apparel, including his iron gloves and the belt of Megingjard or Megingjara in Old Norse. But, like comic books and popular culture tout, the most common item associated with Thor undoubtedly pertains to the dwarf-crafted hammer Mjolnir, roughly translated to lightning, thus alluding to how thunder was perceived by the pre-Christianity-era Norsemen as the result of Thor striking his hammer, presumably when slaying giants and monsters while riding his chariot drawn by two giant goats at Tangneost and Tangrisnir. Interestingly enough, Thor was also regarded as the god of agriculture, fertility, and hallowing. Pertaining to the former, this aspect was probably an extension of Thor's role as a sky god who was also responsible for rain. To that end, Thor's wife Sif and her golden hair possibly symbolized the fields of grain, and thus their union embodied the fruitfulness and verdancy of the lands. As for our modern context, Thursday is derived from Old English "Yrsk," a contraction possibly influenced by Old Norse Orsdagur of unrest, which literally means Thursday. Baldur, the god of light and purity. Baldur, or Baldur in Old Norse, the younger son of Odin and Frigg, half-brother of Thor, was regarded as the Sur-god of light and purity. He epitomized the effulgent summer sun itself. Baldur was also hailed as a fair, wise, and gracious divine being whose beauty even abashed the elegant flowers before him. Matching his physical attributes, his abode Breidablik in Asgard was considered the most exquisite of all halls, in the stronghold of the Norse gods, flaunting its gilded silver components and embellished pillars that only allowed the purest of hearts to enter. Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson wrote, "There is nothing but good to be told of him. He is the best of them, and everyone sings his praises. He is so fair of face and bright that a splendor radiates from him. And there is a flower so white that it is like unto Baldur's brow. It is the whitest of all flowers. From that you can tell how beautiful his body is and how bright his hair. He is the wisest of gods, and the sweetest spoken, and the most merciful. But it is a characteristic of his that once he has pronounced a judgment it can never be altered." Baldur, among all the gods, also possessed the greatest ship ever built, Hringhorni, which was later used as the funeral pyre after the god's tragic death. Relating to this deplorable incident, Baldur was mistakenly killed by Hr, Baldur's twin brother, who was blind. Hr was presented with a dart made of mistletoe by the cunning Loki, who knew that Baldur was impervious to all living elements on the face of Asgard and Midgard, except for the seemingly harmless mistletoe. That is because Frigg, Balder's mother, missed the mistletoe when making a plea to most living things when it came to causing no harm to her delicate son. So the dart thrown jokingly at Balder, as was the habit among the Norse gods, directly pierced his heart and slew him, instead of bouncing off the god. Consequently, many of the grief-stricken Norse gods even tried to bring back Balder from the domain of Hel, but to no avail. And thus the wise god was lost to them on account of Loki's cruel prank. Vidar, the silent god of vengeance. Vidar, or Var in Old Norse, possibly translated to Wide Ruler, was one of Odin's sons and the Jtun Grid or GRR. And he was often represented as the silent god of vengeance, with his name attested in the Poetic Edda. His association with vengeance probably stems from the foretelling of how he would avenge his father's Odin's death, by killing the ferocious Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, at the Ragnarok. Incredibly enough, he is also counted among the very few major Norse gods who would survive the final conflict, and thereafter dwell on the field of Idavall. In Gylfaginning first part of Poetic Edda, Vidar is mentioned to wear a thick shoe like Thor, which is constantly mended by the god himself. That is because the shoe would keep Vidar relatively safe as he plunges his foot down Fenrir's throat to smash the monster's heart at the Ragnarok, although Vlist mentions how Vidar would slay Fenrir by thrusting his sword into the wolf's heart. To that end, there might have been a tradition among the Norse shoemakers to keep or dedicate little scraps of leather from the trimmings of their shoes to aid the silent god of vengeance. As for his attribute of silence, it might have to do with the ritual of vengeance which subjected warriors to periods of silence, possibly as a means of focusing or as part of the rites of purification. In that regard, the powerful god Vidar was said to be almost as strong as Thor, but not particularly as boisterous as his renowned half-brother. Interestingly enough, in terms of etymology and history, Georges Dumsel hypothesized how the figure of Vidaret, the son of Odin, evolved from an Indo-European cosmic entity related to spaces or realms, much like Vishnu from Hindu mythology. Tyr, the god of war. Tyr or Tyr in Old Norse, the deity of war and heroic glory, was regarded as the bravest of the Norse gods of the Germanic people. And in spite of his association with wars, more specifically the formalities of conflict, including treaties, his origins are rather enigmatic, with the deity possibly being one of the oldest and most important gods of the ancient Germanic pantheon. That is, until he was supplanted by Odin. Many myths declared her as a son of Odin, while other stories placed her as the son of the giant Hymir. In any case, since some of the aspects of Tyr related to formalities, the god was also hailed as the deity of justice and oaths. Tyr was often depicted as the one-handed god since his limb was bitten off by the monstrous wolf Fenrir when the god tried to trap the creature, and Fenrir was thus successfully bound till Ragnarok due to the sacrifice of Tyr. In spite of this episode, Tyr is foretold to be slain by Garm, the guard dog of Hel, as opposed to Fenrir according to the prose version of Ragnarok. And like some other Norse gods, Tyr also has significance in our modern-day context. In that regard, the Old English variant of his name is Ty, and he was associated with Mars by the Romans, and thus Dies Marty Mars Day came to be known as Tywest Tuesday. Bragi, the bard god of Asgard. Bragi, which roughly translates to poet in Old Norse, often considered the skaldic god of poetry in Norse mythology, pertains to a unique mythical character who possibly shared traits with the historical 9th century bard Bragi Boddason. Boddason himself might have served in the courts of Ragnar Lodbrok and Björn at Hodge. In any case, when it came to legends, the god Bragi was perceived as the bard of Valhalla, the magnificent hall of Odin where all the fallen heroes and warriors are gathered for the ultimate showdown at Ragnarok. Snorri Sturluson wrote in Gylfaginning. One is called Bragi. He is renowned for wisdom, and most of all for fluency of speech and skill with words. He knows most of scholarship, and after him scholarship is called Brager. And from his name that one is called Brager man or woman, who possesses eloquence surpassing others, of women or of men. His wife is a Norse goddess associated with apples and youth. As for the Norse gods' historical counterparts, there are a few candidates other than Bragi Boddason mentioned in various poetic Edda pieces. The names include Bragi son of Halfdan the Old mentioned in Skuld Skaparmal and Bragi Gnassim mentioned in the second part of Helgatvia Hunding's Bana. Idun, the youthful goddess of rejuvenation. Pronounced I-H-Dun, from Old Norse Ihun, the rejuvenating one is a goddess who belongs to the Aesir tribe of deities. Her role in the pre-Christian mythology and religion of the Norse and other Germanic peoples is unfortunately obscure, but she features prominently in one of the best-known mythological tales, the kidnapping of Idun. In this tale, which comes to us from the skaldic poem Hausaln and the prose Edda, Idun is depicted as the owner and dispenser of a fruit that imparts immortality. In modern books on Norse mythology, these fruits are almost invariably considered to be apples. But this wasn't necessarily the case in pagan times. The Old Norse word for apple, epli, was often used to denote any fruit or nut, and apples in the modern English sense didn't arrive in Scandinavia until late in the Middle Ages. Whatever species Iduns produce belongs to, its ability to sustain the immortality of the gods and goddesses makes Idun an indispensable presence in Asgard. Idun is the wife of Asgard's court poet and minstrel, Bragi. One Old Norse poem has Loki accuse her of sleeping with her brother's murder, but the identities of her brother and his slayer are unknown, and no tale explaining this accusation has survived into the modern era. Unfortunately, that's about all we know about Idun, due to the sparseness of mentions of her in the sources of our present-day knowledge of Norse mythology and religion. Loki, the trickster god. Loki is regarded as the trickster among the Norse gods, represented as having qualities somewhat akin to the chaotic aspects of the ancient Egyptian god Set. Interestingly, Loki Ezichton, being the son of giant Farbodi and Jontis or goddess Laufey, also possesses the power to shapeshift. Essentially, he is projected as a mischievous god who is not entirely evil and has whimsical purposes, and yet particularly scheming in his cruel actions, many of which lead to misfortunes and even tragedies, like the accidental death of Balder. Now given his heritage as an outsider among the Ser tribe of gods, the narrative of Loki in ancient stories might have served as a plot device that provides a soft antithesis to the other gods. His complex relationship with other gods, particularly Thor, comes to light from different sources. For example, in Lokasenna or Loki's Quarrel, one of the poems of Poetic Edda, Loki keeps on insulting Thor and then goes into hiding, fearing the hammer Mjolnir. On the other hand, in Thrymskvia, or anglicized as Thrymskvida, Thor and Loki share their camaraderie when they together hatch a plan to retrieve the stolen Mjolnir from a Jtun named Rimmer. However, in spite of Loki's complicated character and narrative, he is foretold to be responsible for the deaths of many Norse gods during Ragnarok. For example, Loki's son, Fenrir the Wolf, will kill Odin, while his other offspring, Jormungandr the Serpent, will poison Thor, that would ultimately lead to the Thunder God's demise. Hel, the ruler of the underworld. We tend to associate Hell with the realm of eternal damnation. Well, its Germanic counterpart was no walk in the park either, with inhabitants like Fenrir the Wolf, Jormungandr the Serpent, and other subjects who had died through sickness and old age. The eponymous Hel was the ruler of this Norse underworld, also called Helheim. She was the daughter of Loki and the giant Angerboda. and it fell upon her to judge and decide the fate of the souls who entered her realm. Descriptions of Hel, the being, have been found in numerous Viking sagas and poems, and most of them portray her as being partly decomposed with a face and a body of a living woman, albeit with a gloomy, downcast appearance, but with thighs and legs of a corpse. Still, among the Norse deities, she was said to be most powerful, even more than Odin himself, inside her own realm, the Hel. The tragic episode of Baldur's death confirms such an association to power, since it ultimately falls upon Hel to decide the fate of the soul of a god who was considered the wisest and most pure of all the Norse gods of Sir. Heimdall, the vigilant guardian of Asgard. Heimdall or Heimdallr in Old Norse was often portrayed as the ever-vigilant guardian of Asgard, the stronghold of the Sir Norse gods. He was also hailed as the descendant of giant Fornjt and the grandson of Cjtun and singular of Jtn Aarger. He is often depicted with his horn Jallar horn resounding horn, which is put to use when intruders approach the home of the Sir tribe of gods. Pertaining to this guarding duty, Heimdall is attested to possess keen eyesight that stretches to hundreds of miles and hearing that even encompasses the sound of wool growing on the sheep. The vigilant deity also has other qualities like having foreknowledge and vast sources of energy that allows him to sleep less than a bird. Interestingly enough, there is a possibility that Heimdallr was once considered to be the father of humankind, as vaguely mentioned in the Old Norse poem Völusp. It is also probable that most Vikings historically perceived Heimdall as being responsible for creating the hierarchy and classes among men. In any case, reverting to mythology, Heimdall also plays an important role in the impending Ragnarok, where he will sound the dire call of Jallar horn to signal the arrival of the giants and monsters. And in the consequent confrontations, Loki and Heimdall are foretold to slay one another. Freya, the goddess of fate and destiny. Freya in Old Norse, meaning lady, though initially belonging to the Vanir tribe of Norse gods like his twin brother Freyr, was also a loyal and honorary member of the Sir after the conclusion of their tribal war. Epitomizing the aspects of love, beauty, and even opulent objects, the goddess was often represented as the seeker of pleasure and the unknown. Focusing on the latter, Freya embodied the Vlva or anglicized Vala, the female seer of the Norse religion who had the ability to tinker with the cider magic pertaining to destiny and its weaving. In essence, Freya had the ability to alter and manipulate one's desire and fortune, thus was often associated with the attitudes of cats. Freya was also regarded among the Norse goddesses as the ruler of the afterlife realm Folkvang, which allowed her to choose half of the warriors who were slain in battle, the other half were guided by the Valkyries to Valhalla. All of these characteristics of a potent Vlva mirror the historical scenario of the Germanic pantheon, especially during the Volker wandering or migration period circa 400 to 800 AD. In that regard, these tribal societies tended to favor the gods at the head of their pantheon, symbolizing the chieftain warrior, who would lead them into battles and plunders, and his wife the prophetess, who would outline the future outcome of such military encounters by her magic. Many historians and scholars believe that these two figures eventually coalesced into what we know as the Norse entities of Odin and Frigg, with the latter being the same or at least sharing similar qualities to the deity who was regarded as Freya. To that end, Freya's husband is often identified as Ar, roughly meaning furor or ecstasy. And in the Old Norse for Odin is just the word Ar with the masculine definite article fin added to the end. Like and subscribe to see more.